A flag stained with hate. Chapter 1. The Shadow in the Stars. It began on a sweltering summer night, beneath a sky that was too quiet, too still, almost as if even the stars refused to bear witness to what was about to unfold. Marcus stood on the porch with his father, the two of them staring at the worn American flag that fluttered from the pole in their front yard. It was supposed to mean something: freedom, pride, belonging. But for them, it meant something else entirely. His father's voice broke the silence. "You see that flag, son? It's never flown for us, not really." Marcus was only 12, but he understood more than most kids his age. He saw how neighbors tensed when his family walked by. He saw how his father's ID was always checked twice, and he saw the shadow in the stars, that invisible stain on a nation's promise. That night, the stars above seemed to flicker with unease. Fireworks cracked in the distance, late leftovers from the 4th of July. But their neighborhood had no celebration, just porch lights turned off early, curtains drawn tight. Across the street, a house flew a different flag, one stitched in anger, one that screamed a message without making a sound. Marcus asked what it meant, and his father's jaw clenched. "It means they still think we don't belong." Later, when Marcus lay in bed, he stared out the window at the sky. The stars were still there, but he couldn't see them the same way. Not after what he'd heard, not after what he'd felt. He closed his eyes and whispered, "One day, I'll change that." And beneath those stars, beneath that flag, a quiet resolve was born, in a boy who saw the shadow but dared to imagine the light beyond it. Chapter 2. Where the Red Ran Deeper. Marcus didn't notice the blood until it was already on his sneakers. It was a week after the 4th of July, and the neighborhood kids had gathered on the old basketball court next to the abandoned rec center. They didn't have a net, just a crooked metal ring that wobbled every time someone made a shot. It didn't matter. They played anyway, because for a few hours, the game made everything else disappear. But that day, something broke the spell. It started with a shout, then a scream. By the time Marcus turned around, James was on the ground, his nose bleeding, his cheeks swelling from where one of the older white teens had hit him. The ball had rolled into their yard. That was the only reason James had crossed the line. "That's our property," the boy had said. "You don't step foot over here." The others had laughed, not just at the hit, but at the look on James' face. Marcus stood frozen, fists clenched. He wanted to run in, to fight. But his father's voice echoed in his mind. "Pick your battles, son. Don't give them what they want." So he helped James up, held his arm as they walked back across the cracked asphalt. But the blood kept dripping, pooling at the edge of the court. Later, Marcus sat on the curb, staring at his shoes. The red had soaked into the laces. He remembered the flag again. Red for valor, they'd taught him in school. But this red wasn't valor. It was pain, humiliation, silence. And it ran deeper than any stride could hold. Chapter 3. Stripes that Divide. The flag outside the courthouse looked freshly cleaned. Marcus noticed it every time his mother drove past on the way to work. It waved with pride over a building that rarely welcomed people who looked like them. Inside that courthouse, his uncle had once stood in shackles for a crime he hadn't committed, sentenced by a jury that didn't include a single black voice. Now, as they stopped at a red light across from the marble steps, Marcus looked at the flag again. It seemed to glow in the sun, but all he could see were the stripes, lines, dividers. He thought about history class, where they were taught the stripes symbolized the original colonies. Unity, they called it. But to Marcus, they looked more like fences, like boundaries carved into cloth to separate what belonged to whom. At school, he had noticed the invisible stripes too. Lunch tables that divided by race, teachers who only called on certain kids, dress code rules that got enforced differently depending on who you were. Stripes. That afternoon, he asked his mother, "Why does everything feel divided?" She kept her eyes on the road. "Because it was built that way, but it doesn't have to stay that way." Her words stayed with him. That night, he pulled out his sketchbook and drew the flag, but instead of red and white stripes, he drew rows of people, shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand. No gaps, no spaces, just one long, unbroken line. The way he wished the world could be. Chapter 4. The pledge we were told to swallow. Every morning at school, the loudspeaker crackled to life at 8 sharp. "Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance." Marcus stood, as always, but the words never came easy, not since he was old enough to understand what they meant, or rather, what they didn't mean, for people like him. He'd watch his classmates place hands over hearts with ease, eyes lifted toward the flag that hung crooked near the chalkboard. But Marcus? He looked at that flag and felt a lump in his throat. Not pride, something closer to resentment. All nation under God indivisible. He said the words, but they always caught on that line, indivisible. It sounded like a joke in a school where segregation still lived at lunch tables and curriculum erased entire histories, where black kids were disciplined more, praised less, and always watched more closely, with liberty and justice for all. Except it wasn't for all, not really. One day, Marcus sat down instead of standing. The teacher didn't say anything at first, but the silence in the room turned heavy. Eyes darted toward him, whispers buzzed. After class, he was called to the office. "Why didn't you stand, Marcus?" the principal asked. He looked the man in the eye. "Because the pledge isn't true. Not for everyone." There was a long pause. Then came a lecture about respect, about tradition, about how lucky he was to live in a free country. But Marcus walked out of the office with a different kind of freedom. The freedom to see the lie and name it. And he knew that was the first step toward something real. Chapter 5. Beneath the school bell's ring. The bell rang at exactly 3:05, just like it always did. A loud metallic clang that echoed through the halls and down into the quiet tension of the school's concrete bones. To most kids, it was a sound of freedom. Books closed, bags slung over shoulders, laughter spilling out onto sunlit sidewalks. But to Marcus, it was something else. It was the sound of leaving behind another day where he had made himself smaller, quieter, less noticeable. The day had started like most, a skipped hand during group discussion, an accidental shove in the hallway, a history class where the teacher said slavery had been a complicated issue and quickly moved on. Marcus had raised his hand to say something, to correct it, but the bell rang before he got the chance. Again. That bell had a way of cutting short what needed to be said. He walked slowly that afternoon, dragging his feet through the gravel path behind the school. It led to a forgotten garden space, overgrown and untouched. He sat on the cracked bench beneath the tree that no one else visited. Here, the silence didn't press against him. It held him. He pulled out his notebook and wrote what he'd wanted to say. A full page, then two, not for a grade, not for credit, just for himself. His words filled the space beneath the silence of the bell. Before he left, he folded the pages and tucked them into a crack in the tree's bark, a small act of rebellion. A seed planted in a place no one looked, because even if the bell silenced him inside those walls, out here his voice could grow roots. The next day he returned, opened his notebook again. This time he wrote about the boy in his science class who was always called on even when his answers were wrong. He wrote about the counselor who steered certain kids away from the honors track. He wrote about what it felt like to be called articulate, like it was a surprise. Each day he returned to the tree. Each day he added more. One afternoon, he found a note wedged in the bark beside his own pages. A simple piece of notebook paper with only 3 words, "I hear you." His heart thudded. Someone had read them. He didn't know who. It didn't matter, because the silence had been broken. The next week he brought extra paper, left it in a small jar at the base of the tree with a pen, a sign above it, "Say what you couldn't in class." Slowly the jar filled. Folded notes, drawings, questions. The tree became a second classroom, one where no hand had to be raised, no permission needed to speak. And one day, maybe someone else would find those words and know they weren't alone. Chapter 6. The March That Wasn't Covered. It started with 10 kids and a handful of cardboard signs. No chants, no camera crews, just quiet determination and scuffed sneakers on hot pavement. Marcus had helped make the signs the night before. Black letters on white poster board. "We matter. Stop looking away. History happened here." They gathered outside the school, under the weight of glances that darted away as quickly as they landed. Teachers said nothing. Cars passed without honking. No news vans showed up. The only thing louder than their footsteps was the silence around them. They marched anyway, from the school to the library, from the library to City Hall, past the bronze statue of the town's founder, a man whose legacy was taught in glowing paragraphs, but whose role in slavery was never mentioned in class. Marcus led the group, his sign shaking slightly in the heat. Sweat dripped down his back. His throat ached with words he hadn't shouted, but his spine stayed straight. He kept looking up, hoping someone would notice, hoping someone would care enough to listen, to write about it, to take a photo, but no one did. When they reached the courthouse steps, they paused in the shade. A security guard came out, not to stop them, but to ask them to move along. "This isn't a permit zone," he said, "and anyway, no one's here to see this." Marcus looked him in the eye. "We're here. That's enough." They walked back slowly, No headlines, no history books. But in Marcus's notebook that night, under the date, he wrote, "We walked anyway, because being seen didn't make their truth real. Living it did." Chapter 7. Barbed Fences and Baseball Fields. On the edge of town stood a baseball field that hadn't been renovated since the 1950 SR. Rusted bleachers leaned at awkward angles, and weeds curled through the chain-link fence like veins through concrete. But it was theirs. Marcus and his friends played there every Saturday. Across the road was the new field. Green turf, polished dugouts, bright lights that lit the diamond even after sunset. But they weren't allowed there, not officially. That field belonged to the Travel League, the one that Marcus and the others had never been invited to join. One afternoon, after their own game ended, Marcus wandered to the edge of their worn-out diamond. He leaned on the fence and stared across the road. The other team was practicing. They had matching jerseys, cleats that still squeaked, a coach who barked orders like they were professionals. Marcus watched in silence. "Don't worry about them," his friend Rico said behind him. "They don't play like us anyway." But Marcus didn't move. He kept watching as a player dove for a catch, rolled cleanly, and popped back up to applause. Then he turned to look at the barbed fence that ran along the back of their own field, the one no one had bothered to fix. A ball had rolled under it once, and Marcus had scraped his hands raw trying to retrieve it. Two fields, two worlds, same game, different rules. That night, Marcus drew 2 diamonds in his notebook. One clean, one scarred. And in between them, he drew a bridge. Not perfect, not fancy, just strong enough to walk across. But he didn't stop there. The next Saturday, Marcus brought paint and a few old boards. Rico and the others raised eyebrows but helped. They patched the splintered bench, refastened the bent backstop, cleaned up the trash and broken bottles the town never bothered to remove. "We fix what's not ours?" someone asked. "Because it is ours," Marcus said, "and they're watching." He knew the kids on the other field saw them, and he knew they saw themselves too, trying to carve beauty from what the world had tossed aside. Weeks later, a local reporter came by, not to write a story, just walking her dog. But she stopped, took photos, asked questions, and a week after that, their field had a name on the rec schedule. Marcus smiled when he saw it. Southfield Diamond, Youth Open Play. Not official, not league certified, but real. They played that Saturday like it was the World Series. And after the game, they crossed the road, stood outside the chain link of the polished field. This time, Marcus didn't just stare. He stepped forward and called out, "Hey, want a scrimmage?" Silence. Then a shrug. Then a smile. And slowly the 2 teams walked toward each other, because even if no one handed him a path, he could still build one. And maybe, just maybe, he could invite others across. Chapter 8. When they painted the flag over our pain. It happened just days after the protest. The same wall where Marcus and his friends had chalked the names of those forgotten, those erased from textbooks and morning announcements, was suddenly different. Overnight, the city painted a flag over it. Red, white, and blue stripes stretched across their tribute, covering every name, every tear-stained word. A patriotic mural, the mayor called it, a symbol of unity. Marcus stood in front of it the next morning, his backpack still slung over one shoulder, heart pounding. The flag gleamed under the early light like fresh paint on an old lie. Rico arrived moments later. "They erased everything." "No," Marcus said. "They tried to." The mural looked flawless to passers-by, but Marcus knew what lay beneath. Layers of names and pain and resistance. The brushstrokes couldn't hide everything. If you looked close enough, you could still see the faint outline of letters beneath the white stripes. He ran his hand over the surface. The paint was still drying. "This isn't unity," Marcus muttered. "It's covering a wound with wallpaper." They sat across the street that afternoon, watching as people took selfies in front of the mural. No one asked what had been there before. No one seemed to care. That night, Marcus returned with a flashlight and chalk. He knelt at the base of the wall and began again. Letter by letter, he wrote one name beneath the red, then another beneath the white, and beneath the blue. "We're still here." Because truth isn't erased by paint. It only waits for someone to uncover it again. Chapter 9. The Street That Changed. No Names. Marcus had walked the same street every day since he was a kid. Jefferson Avenue. It led to the corner store, the barber shop, the school. It was the kind of street where history lingered in the cracks of the sidewalk and the tilt of the porch railings. But it was also a name he could never forget. Thomas Jefferson. His teacher once praised him as a founding father, a genius, a man of liberty. But Marcus had done his own reading. He knew about Sally Hemings, about the hundreds enslaved, about the contradictions etched into the man who helped write the words, "All men are created equal." Every time Marcus passed the green street sign, a slow burn crept through him. He brought it up once, in class during a unit on government. Why do we still name streets after men who didn't believe people like me should be free? His teacher blinked. "That's just history," she said. "We can't change the past." But Marcus didn't want to change the past. He wanted the truth to matter. A few weeks later, someone taped a hand-painted sign under the street marker. Elijah Greenway in thick black letters. Elijah had been the first black man to open a store in that neighborhood. His store had stood on that very corner for 30 years. The next morning the sign was gone. No one said who took it down. But that night, Marcus saw new ones appear. More signs, hand-lettered, on every block. Names of teachers, elders, musicians, activists. People who had built the street, even if it didn't carry their names. Because even if the city didn't change it, the people already had. Chapter 10. Statues that spoke without apology. The statue stood at the center of town square, towering above the fountain where families posed for pictures on sunny weekends. It depicted a general from a war Marcus had only ever seen mentioned in footnotes, bronze coat stiff with imagined pride, chin tilted skyward, gaze set far beyond the crowd that now passed him daily. But Marcus always looked up, because the plaque beneath the statue didn't list everything. It named battles, not people. It called him a hero, not a slave owner. It painted a man in glory while erasing the bodies he built that glory upon? Marcus asked about it once, during civics class. Why do we still honor him? The teacher glanced at the clock. He's part of our heritage. It's complicated. That word again, complicated. That weekend, Marcus and his mother walked through the square. She avoided the statue, but Marcus didn't. He walked right up to it, stared into the eyes of bronze silence, and whispered, "Say their names." That night, he stayed up late reading about the man, the war, the lives beneath the legacy. The next morning, he returned to the square. He stood alone and read a list of names into the wind. Names that were never carved in stone. Names that history left in the shadows. He didn't shout. He didn't protest. He just read. And for a moment, even the wind paused. But that wasn't the end. Marcus returned every day that week. Each day he brought a new name, a new story, a candle, a flower. By the third day, people started to notice. Some stopped to listen. Others shook their heads and walked faster. A woman left a sticky note on the statue's base. "Thank you for remembering." On Friday, Marcus brought a small speaker. He played audio clips, testimonies from descendants of the enslaved, poems by Black authors, clips from speeches that never made it into their school assemblies. The statue never changed, but something around it did. One morning, Marcus arrived to find another student already there, reading from their own list. Another day, a group of kids brought cardboard signs and sat silently in the grass. The fountain still gurgled, families still posed, but behind every smiling photo, the statue was now flanked by truth. It was no longer just a monument. It had become a conversation. Because when statues speak without apology, sometimes the only way to answer is to speak truth louder than silence. And sometimes, silence itself becomes the loudest change of all. Chapter 11. A Bullet and a Banner. The sirens came before the silence. Marcus was walking home from the library when the sound shattered the late afternoon calm. It was the kind of wail that turned stomachs and slowed time. He followed the noise, not because he wanted to see, but because something in his chest told him he already knew. The crowd had gathered on the corner where Jefferson and Pine met. Police tape fluttered like warning flags in the breeze. Behind it, a body lay still, covered, motionless, but the shape was unmistakable. It was Jamal, 16 years old, a kid who loved sneakers, sketching logos, and making beats on the school lunch table. He had been walking to the corner store. "Wrong place, wrong time," someone whispered. But Marcus knew that wasn't it. Jamal had been wearing a hoodie. That was all it took. Someone else said he looked suspicious. Someone else thought he might have been reaching. Someone else pulled a trigger. That night, the town released a statement. It called the incident tragic. It called Jamal a promising young man. It called for peace and patience. What it didn't do was apologize. The next morning, a banner appeared over the courthouse. Red, white, and blue with bold block letters. Justice for all. Marcus stood beneath it, fists clenched at his sides. Because for some, justice came with apologies and trials and tears. For others, it came with silence. That night, he wrote Jamal's name in chalk across the sidewalk. Then he wrote it again, and again, until there wasn't room for anything else. because banners don't bring justice, but maybe memory does. Chapter 12. The parade we weren't invited to. It came through town like a brass-drenched storm. Marching bands, cheerleaders, floats covered in red, white, and blue. The annual Heritage Day parade. Everyone knew about it. Posters had gone up weeks in advance. Schools let out early. Businesses closed. People lined the sidewalks with lawn chairs and flags. But no one had asked Marcus or his friends if they wanted to be part of it. No one invited the step team from the community center. No one called the jazz trio who played every Sunday outside the church on 5th. No one even asked the black-owned bakery if they wanted to sell pies from a float. So they stood on the sidelines, watching, clapping half-heartedly as a float passed bearing the image of the town's founder, followed by beauty queens waving like royalty. One float was painted like an old plantation house. Marcus's mother gripped his hand tighter. He tried to find the joy in it, tried to smile when the high school band passed, but something inside him twisted when the crowd roared at the veterans' float, only because he remembered the way his grandfather, a Vietnam vet, had been ignored every time he asked the VFW for membership. When the last float passed and the parade moved down the street, Marcus turned away. That night, he and his friends gathered at the community center. They played music, danced, shared food. They laughed, even as the ache lingered. Because if the town wasn't going to invite them to the celebration, they'd create one of their own. And in that small parking lot, lit by string lights and boomboxes, they found something more honest than anything the parade had offered. Belonging that didn't need permission. Chapter 13. Hands raised for the wrong reasons. The assembly was supposed to be about school spirit. Banners hung from the rafters, a cheer squad performed, the principal stood at the mic and spoke about pride and unity. But when the awards started, Marcus felt his chest tighten. One by one names were called. Honor roll, perfect attendance, citizenship. He clapped for every name, but not a single one looked like him. The teachers smiled politely. "You're doing great," they'd say in private. But praise never left the hallway. It never made it to the stage. Then came the Student Leadership Award. The boy who received it had mocked Marcus 2 weeks earlier for wearing a hoodie with an African flag patch. Said it looked like a gang symbol. The teacher had told Marcus not to make a big deal out of it. Now that same boy stood with a medal around his neck. Marcus's hand remained on his lap. Other students raised their hands when asked to vote for next year's class officers. Marcus knew some of them had never spoken up in class, never volunteered, never led, but they smiled the right way. They blended. When it was over, Marcus walked out of the gym. A teacher called after him, "Where are you going?" He didn't answer. Outside, under the flagpole, he raised his own hand. Not to vote, not to celebrate, but to remember who gets seen and who gets erased. Because sometimes a raised hand isn't about questions. It's about resistance. Chapter 14. The Stitch That Unraveled. It started with a conversation in the hallway. Marcus overheard two teachers talking between classes. One of them mentioned a new diversity committee forming at the district level. "It's all performative," the other replied with a laugh. They'll stitch a few faces in and call it equity. That word stitch stuck with Marcus all day. He thought about how institutions patch things together when they're called out. One black student in a commercial, one cultural poster in the cafeteria, one speaker during Black History Month, just enough to say, look, we're trying, but never enough to hold anything real. Later that afternoon, the hem of Marcus's sleeve caught on a door frame. A single thread came loose. He tugged at it without thinking, and the entire cuff began to unravel. That's what the system felt like to him now. Threads barely holding the fabric together. At dinner, he asked his mother, "What does it take to make something new?" She looked up from her plate. More than just patching holes. That night, Marcus sat on his bedroom floor surrounded by scraps. Old homework, protest signs, drawings, history articles he'd printed and saved. He began taping them together, one page at a time, not to make a flag, but something different, something honest. The next day, he brought it to school. He didn't ask permission, he hung it on the community board. Students stopped to read it, some added to it. Notes, names, stories. One student wrote, "This is what they didn't teach us." Another added a poem. "I was born in between lines, / between history and silence." By the end of the week, the board overflowed. The janitor put up an extra panel, then another. A teacher who usually stayed silent left a message. "Keep writing." One morning, Marcus saw a girl with tears in her eyes place her grandmother's photo next to a quote about survival. He watched as a football player who had never said more than 2 words to him quietly pinned a note. "My cousin was stopped for no reason. I never told anyone." The board changed shape. It wasn't a collage anymore, it was a mirror, a collective confession, a map of the cracks in the school's walls, and the people brave enough to show them. The principal called Marcus into her office. He thought he was in trouble, but she pointed to the board on her monitor and said, "What you've built matters. Do you want to speak at the next assembly?" Marcus paused, then smiled. "No," he said. "Let the board speak. It already knows what to say." It wasn't stitched together for show. It was built from truth. And truth doesn't unravel. It reveals. Chapter 15. A new cloth, a new promise. It began with a piece of fabric. Not a flag. Not a banner, just a square of canvas Marcus had found in the back of the art room. Blank. Unwritten. Unclaimed. He brought it home, pinned it to the wall of his bedroom, and stared at it for days. It was quiet, yet expectant, and slowly he began to fill it, not with stars and stripes, but with stories. A sketch of the old man who swept the sidewalks every morning before the town woke up. A patch of color for Jamal. The names from the wall they'd painted over. The chalk outlines from the sidewalk. A handprint in red, not for violence, but for remembrance. Each mark told a truth the country had tried to fold away. At school, he asked others to add their own, a poem, a ribbon, a photo, a memory. The cloth grew heavier, fuller. By the end of the week, it was too large to hang in the hallway, so they took it outside. Strung it up between 2 trees, the wind caught its edges and made it dance. People gathered, unsure at first, but then they stepped forward. Teachers, parents, students who had never spoken out before. One by one, they reached for the cloth and added something of their own. It wasn't neat. It wasn't symmetrical. But it was real. Marcus stayed with it every day after school, watching as the cloth transformed into something living, layered with memory and meaning. An elder brought a photo of her brother who had marched in Selma. A little girl tied a pink shoelace from her late sister's sneakers. One boy drew a cracked bell with the word truth echoing from it. It was no longer just their cloth. It was their declaration. A teacher brought her class to see it. They wrote journal entries and left them folded in a basket at the base. Even the principal, who had once lectured Marcus for sitting during the pledge, left a single yellow carnation and walked away in silence. A local reporter came, took a picture, asked questions. Marcus didn't answer. He just gestured toward the cloth. "Everything I have to say," he said, "is already here." And when Marcus looked up at it, swaying under the sun, he didn't see rebellion or resistance. He saw something beginning, a new story stitched together not from silence or fear, but from the voices that had once been pushed aside. A new cloth, a new promise, not one they were told to believe in, one they had made for themselves. And for the first time, Marcus believed this was the America they could one day inherit. Not perfect, but theirs.